The tow
Get
truck's
off me! I
winch
didn't do
clicked
anything!
once,
Stop resisting!
and
Hands
the
behind
whole
my
morning
back!
shifted. What
You're
looked
hurting
like
me!
an
Let go!
abandoned rust
Down
bucket
now!
outside a federal
That's
building
assault!
was
I'll
actually
sue!
a live
You're under
asset
arrest!
tied to an active protective detail. The driver didn't know that. The patrol sergeant who signed off on the tow knew even less. By the chain tightened, somebody inside Washington had already started asking one question. Who touched that truck? Just after 8:10 a.m., the air over downtown Norfolk already had that sticky coastal heat rising off the pavement. Delivery vans were double parked. A city bus hissed at the curb. A sanitation truck clanged somewhere down the block. Normal Tuesday sounds. Routine. Forgettable. The pickup didn't look like it belonged in front of the old brick municipal annex. It was a faded brown Ford F-150 with oxidized paint, one cracked taillight, and enough rust around the wheel wells to make it look half forgotten. The passenger side mirror was taped in place with black electrical tape. There was dirt caked along the rocker panels, and a coffee-stained parking slip tucked under the wiper. Nothing about it suggested value. That was the point. Two men in suits had passed it earlier without making eye contact. One crossed the street. The other paused at the corner long enough to glance at the windshield, then continued walking. No panic, no signal, just a look. Across the street, Officer Daniel Pritchard sat in his cruiser with the engine running and the AC turned high enough to fog the edges of the windshield. He had been on the job 11 years, long enough to develop instincts, long enough to stop listening to the better ones. Pritchard wasn't a street cop in the heroic sense. He was the kind who treated quiet mornings like invitations. If nothing serious was happening, he found smaller ways to exercise control. Parking enforcement, tow authorizations, pressure. Tiny humiliations dressed up as procedure. He sipped burnt coffee from a paper cup and stared at the truck. Then he checked the plate again on his in-car terminal. The return was strange. Not stolen, not flagged, but incomplete. Registration was shielded behind a federal use privacy mask that should have told him to leave it alone and call it in through the chain. Instead, he leaned back and smirked. To him, it looked like a clerical mess. Government people were sloppy all the time. Contractors forgot permits, temporary credentials expired, someone parked where they thought rules didn't apply. And Pritchard, on mornings like this, enjoyed correcting that. His radio cracked. Unit 12, status check. Pritchard thumbed the mic without taking his eyes off the Ford. 12, clear. Then he called parking control and asked for a tow. Not because the truck was blocking a hydrant. It wasn't. Not because it posed a hazard. It didn't. Because the plate return annoyed him, and annoyance was often enough. On the second floor of the annex, behind tinted glass, a woman in a navy blazer watched the curb from a conference room window. She didn't react when the tow truck turned the corner. She didn't reach for her phone right away either. She just watched. That mattered later. The tow operator, a heavy-set contractor named Leon Babcock, rolled down his window and shouted, "This the one?" Pritchard stepped out, one hand resting near his belt, the other gesturing casually toward the Ford. "Yeah," he said. "Tag it and move it." Leon looked through the windshield. "You sure? No posted notice on it? No orange sticker?" Pritchard's jaw tightened almost invisibly. That was the first shift. Small. The kind most people miss. When someone challenged him in public, even mildly, he always answered a little sharper than necessary. "I said move it." Leon lifted both hands. Not argumentative, just cautious. "All right." Metal arms lowered, chains rattled across asphalt. A hook scraped under the front axle with a sound that made a few pedestrians turn. At the corner, a man in a gray ball cap stopped walking. He wasn't dressed like law enforcement. Khaki pants, windbreaker, phone in hand, the sort of face people forgot a second after seeing it. He looked at the truck, then at Pritchard, then down at his screen. Still no panic. Across the street, Pritchard noticed him looking and held the stare a second too long. Territorial, defensive. The man in the cap simply slipped the phone back into his pocket and kept standing there. A bus door folded shut. Air brakes exhaled. Somewhere behind the annex, a steel service door slammed. The chain tightened, and that's when the second odd thing happened. The truck's alarm didn't go off. Most old pickups with bad wiring did something when you jerked them hard enough. A chirp, a weak horn pulse, a flash. This one stayed silent. Completely silent. Leon frowned up from the rig controls. Battery dead. Pritchard shrugged. Not my problem, but he noticed it too. No alarm, no owner running out, no frantic call from reception. Just that woman upstairs at the tinted window, now no longer pretending not to watch. Pritchard pulled a yellow tow authorization pad from his cruiser and started filling it out on the hood. Date, time, violation code, location. He wrote faster than he should have. Under reason for impound, he marked, unauthorized parking / municipal obstruction. Neither was true. His pen dug deep enough to tear the paper slightly at the bottom. From the sidewalk, an older maintenance worker paused with a broom in hand and said, mostly to himself, "That truck's been there every Tuesday." Pritchard looked up. "Keep moving." The worker did, but not before giving the Ford one more puzzled glance. Every Tuesday. That detail would matter too. Leon began winching the truck up by inches. The rusty front bumper groaned. The suspension flexed. One of the taped mirror edges peeled loose and fluttered in the heat. Then Pritchard's cruiser terminal pinged. Once, a quiet system tone. Easy to ignore. He ignored it. He tore the top sheet off the pad and slapped it against the clipboard. The carbon copy underneath showed the pressure marks from his handwriting, like scars. The ping came again. This time, he glanced over. A message header had appeared on the terminal screen. Verify before impound. Federal contact recommended. He stared at it for maybe half a second. Then he closed the alert. Not because he misunderstood it, because backing down in front of the tow driver, the pedestrians, and whoever was watching from the window felt worse than being wrong. That was the real mistake. Not the tow itself. Not yet. The decision to keep going after the warning. Leon called out, "Once I load it, where you want it dropped?" "South impound," Pritchard said. Leon hesitated. "That lot's full till noon." Pritchard didn't even look at him. "Then stack it." The answer hung there a second. Cold. Needlessly aggressive. On the far curb, the man in the gray cap raised his phone again, but this time not like he was texting, more like he was documenting the position of the truck, the tow number on the door, the cruiser unit marking, the officer's face. Pritchard saw that too. He started toward him. "Problem?" he asked. The man's expression didn't change. "No, officer." "You with the owner?" "No." "Then keep walking." The man slid the phone away with calm, deliberate fingers. "Sure." He took 2 steps back, not intimidated, just creating space. There was something about that composure that should have registered. People challenged by cops on a public sidewalk usually reacted one of 2 ways, defensive or submissive. This man did neither. He simply watched Pritchard as if he had already seen enough. The radio crackled again, louder this time. "Unit 12, supervisor asking if you made contact with registered party." Pritchard pressed the mic. "Negative contact, vehicle in violation, tow in progress." A beat of static. Then dispatch answered, more carefully than before. "Copy. Stand by." Stand by. That phrase was usually nothing, but the way dispatch said it, slower, flatter, made Leon glance up from the controls. Even the woman upstairs moved away from the window. For the first time that morning, something in the scene stopped feeling ordinary. Not dramatic, not visible, just off. Like a room changing temperature. Pritchard felt it and pushed against it the only way he knew how. He squared his shoulders, adjusted his vest, and signed the final line on the form with a hard slash of ink. Control through paperwork. Control through posture. Control through refusing to notice the warning signs gathering around him. The Ford's front tires lifted clear off the street. At that exact moment, A black Suburban turned onto the block and slowed without using a siren. No lights, no noise. Just a clean, deliberate roll toward the annex curb. Leon saw it first, then the man in the gray cap, then Pritchard. And when Pritchard looked at the windshield of the old, rusted truck one more time, he noticed something he had somehow missed from 6 feet away. Low on the passenger side, tucked behind the parking slip, was a temporary federal access placard. Not flashy, not obvious, but real. And suddenly, every small thing from the last 4 minutes started arranging itself into a much worse picture. Some mornings don't fall apart all at once. They come loose, one sound at a time. And this one had just started. If you've ever seen someone mistake silence for safety, you already know what kind of day this is becoming. The Suburban rolled closer, and Pritchard, finally, stopped moving. The Suburban didn't rush. It didn't need to. It rolled to a slow, controlled stop, about 20 feet behind the tow truck. Engine still running. Windows tinted just enough to conceal movement, not enough to hide intent. No lights, no siren. That was the first signal. Pritchard felt it before he understood it. Leon muttered under his breath, "That yours?" "No," Pritchard said. But his voice had changed, just slightly, less certain, tighter around the edges. The tow rig whined as it continued lifting the truck. Metal under tension. Hydraulics pushing past a point of comfort. From inside the Suburban, a door opened. Not slammed, not rushed, opened. A man stepped out in a dark suit, earpiece barely visible against his collar. He didn't announce himself, didn't flash anything. He simply looked at the truck first, then at the chain, then at Pritchard. Measured, quiet. Like someone verifying a detail he already suspected. The man in the gray cap exhaled slowly on the sidewalk, almost like confirmation. Pritchard straightened up, shifting his weight forward. Control posture. "Can I help you?" he called out. The suited man didn't answer right away. He walked past the cruiser, past the tow truck, stopping just short of the lifted front tires of the Ford. His eyes moved once across the windshield, paused on the placard, then back to Pritchard. "You authorized this tow?" he asked. Voice calm, neutral, no edge. Pritchard stepped closer. "Vehicles in violation." "Of what?" "Municipal obstruction." The suited man glanced at the curb. Clear hydrant, clear lane. No signage conflict. That glance lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Behind him, a second door on the Suburban opened. Another agent stepped out, already speaking quietly into his sleeve mic. Low voice, controlled pace. "Confirming contact. Yes, asset is being moved." That word, asset, hung in the air longer than it should have. Leon froze his hand over the controls. "Asset?" he repeated quietly. Pritchard ignored him. "Look," Pritchard said, firmer now. "If you've got an issue, you can take it up with the department. Right now, this vehicle is being impounded." The suited man nodded once. Not agreement, acknowledgement. Then he reached into his jacket, not fast, not slow, and produced a credential wallet. He didn't snap it open dramatically. He just held it where Pritchard could see. Gold seal, blue backing, federal, United States Secret Service. No words followed it. They didn't need to. For a fraction of a second, Pritchard didn't react. Not outwardly, but something shifted behind his eyes. A recalculation. Still, he held his ground. "Okay," Pritchard said. "Then you should have marked the vehicle properly." It was the wrong response. Not aggressive, not defensive. Just misaligned, like he was still operating inside a smaller problem. The first agent tilted his head slightly. "It is marked." Pritchard gestured at the windshield. That's not visible from the street. It wasn't meant to be." Silence. Short, heavy. The kind that doesn't escalate. It compresses. Behind them, dispatch came back over the radio, sharper now. "Unit 12, confirm you are still on that tow. Supervisor is requesting immediate status." Pritchard didn't answer right away. That hesitation was new. The second agent stepped closer to the tow truck. eyes scanning the hook placement, the chain tension, the angle of lift. "Lower it," he said to Leon. Leon looked at Pritchard. That was the pivot. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a contractor deciding whose authority mattered more. Pritchard noticed it, and for the first time, irritation crept into his voice. "Do not lower that vehicle," he said. Leon swallowed. I need clear direction here." The first agent didn't raise his voice. "Lower the vehicle." Same tone, same pace. No threat, no emphasis, just certainty. Leon's hand hovered over the lever. The hydraulic system hissed softly, waiting. Pritchard stepped closer to him. "You're under contract with the city. You follow my instruction." The agent took one step forward, not toward Leon, toward Pritchard. "That vehicle is part of an active federal protective operation," he said. "You are interfering with it." Another small shift. The words weren't loud, but they changed the scale of everything, from a local decision to a federal problem. Pritchard's jaw flexed. He looked at the truck again, then at the Suburban, then back at the badge, still not fully accepting it. "Then why wasn't it flagged properly in the system?" he asked. There it was. Justification. The last layer before doubt sets in. The second agent answered this time, without looking up from the truck. It was. That landed differently, because Pritchard knew it was true. He had seen the alert. He had closed it. The radio cracked again, louder. "Unit 12, stand down and confirm. Repeat, stand down." That word didn't leave room for interpretation. "Stand down." Leon pulled his hand back from the controls completely. "I'm not touching it," he said under his breath. The man in the gray cap had stopped pretending to be a bystander now. He stood still, watching openly, documenting, remembering. The first agent stepped even closer to Pritchard. Not confrontational, just within range where conversation didn't need volume. "What time did you initiate the tow?" he asked. "Procedural. Precise." Pritchard hesitated. "About 8:15. The agent nodded once. "Who cleared it?" No answer. Because there wasn't one that helped. The paperwork in Pritchard's hand suddenly felt heavier. The carbon copy edges bent slightly under his grip. A gust of warm air pushed down the street, rattling loose debris against the curb. Somewhere nearby, a car alarm finally did go off. But not from this truck. Wrong sound, wrong moment. And that made it worse. The agent extended his hand. "Give me the authorization." Pritchard didn't move. Not yet. This was the edge. The exact point where confidence either stabilizes or fractures. And right then, it was starting to fracture. Slowly, quietly, irreversibly. If you've ever watched someone realize they're no longer the highest authority in the room, you know this moment. It doesn't explode. It tightens. The Suburban's rear door opened again. A third figure stepped out. Older, slower, carrying nothing visible. But everyone on that curb felt it. This wasn't just a correction anymore. It was becoming a response. And Pritchard was still holding the paper. For a second too long, no one moved. Pritchard still held the tow authorization form. The paper had become more than paperwork now. It was the last thin layer of control he had left, and he knew it. Not consciously, but instinctively. The older man from the Suburban approached without urgency. Late 50s, maybe early 60s. No visible badge, no raised voice. Just presence. The kind that didn't need introduction. He stopped beside the first agent, eyes briefly scanning the scene. The lifted truck, the frozen tow operator, the cruiser idling with its door still open. Then he looked at Pritchard. "Is the vehicle still in motion?" he asked. Not accusatory, procedural. Pritchard answered automatically. "Yes." "Then stop it." Simple. Direct. Final. Leon didn't wait this time. The hydraulics reversed with a low groan. The front tires descended inch by inch, until they touched asphalt again with a dull, final thud. That sound mattered, because it marked the exact moment control shifted away from Pritchard completely. No announcement, no argument, just gravity taking over. The chain slackened, metal clinked softly, and suddenly the truck wasn't going anywhere. Pritchard exhaled through his nose, slow, controlled, but his grip on the paper tightened again. He wasn't done. Not yet. "I still need clarification," he said, looking at the older man now. "This vehicle wasn't properly—" "It was," the older man cut in, still calm. But this time, there was weight behind it. Not volume. Authority. He extended his hand, not for a handshake. "For the form." Pritchard hesitated. That hesitation, barely noticeable, didn't go unseen. The first agent shifted his stance slightly. Not aggressive, just ready. Behind them, the second agent had already moved toward the rear of the Ford, checking something near the tailgate. His fingers traced along the rusted seam, then stopped at a tiny, almost invisible seam in the metal. A panel, not factory. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He just looked up and gave a small nod. Another silent confirmation. The man in the gray cap stepped off the curb now, no longer pretending distance. He moved closer, but not too close, just within earshot. Listening. Logging. Pritchard finally handed over the authorization form. The older man took it without a word. His eyes moved across the page quickly. Violation code. Time. Signature. Then he flipped it once, checking the carbon impression underneath. Pressure marks. Deep. Aggressive. That told him something too. "You initiated this at 8:14, the older man said. "Yes." No supervisor approval. It wasn't required. The older man looked up. A pause. Not long. Just enough. "That depends on what you knew at 8:14. There it was. The shift from action to accountability. Pritchard's jaw tightened again. "The system didn't give me clear—" The first agent stepped in slightly. "It gave you a federal contact warning." Not a question. A statement. Pritchard didn't respond, because denying it would be worse. And confirming it, worse still. The radio cracked again, sharper than before. "Unit 12, supervisor is en route. ETA 2 minutes. Do not take further action." 2 minutes. That suddenly felt very short. The older man folded the TOW authorization once. Clean. Precise. Then he handed it back. Not dismissed. "Return. You're going to want to remember exactly what you saw on that screen," he said. No threat. Just inevitability. Pritchard took the paper, but didn't look at it, because now something else was happening. Inside his cruiser, the terminal lit up again. This time, not a soft ping, a sustained tone, different priority, different system. Leon glanced toward it. "That yours?" Pritchard turned slowly and stepped back to the open driver's side door. The screen had changed. No longer a local database, no longer parking enforcement. A federal overlay had taken priority. Text across the top. External agency access. Do not alter status. Below it, a live log, time-stamped. Every action. Plate query. Alert issued. Alert dismissed. Tow initiated. All of it recorded. Automatically. Pritchard stared at it, silent. Behind him, the second agent finally spoke again. "Sir," he said to the older man, "we should assume compromise window started at first contact." The older man nodded once. Agreed. Compromise. That word didn't belong to parking violations. It belonged to something much larger. Pritchard turned back around. "You're making this bigger than it is," he said. But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. The first agent studied him carefully. "No," he said. "You did." Silence. Heavy now. Not uncertain anymore. Definition. The man in the gray cap finally spoke. Almost casually. "You logged him." The second agent nodded. "Already done." That exchange was quiet, but it landed harder than anything else so far, because it confirmed something Pritchard hadn't considered until this moment. This wasn't just being handled, it was being documented. From the beginning, across the street, 2 more unmarked vehicles turned onto the block. No lights, no urgency, just presence, expanding. Pritchard noticed them. Of course he did, and this time, He didn't step forward, didn't assert control, didn't correct anyone. He just stood there, still holding the same piece of paper, but now it meant nothing. That was the cage, not handcuffs, not the cruiser, not even the federal agents. It was the realization that every decision he'd made in the last 10 minutes was now fixed, logged, and about to be reviewed by people far outside his chain of command. If you've ever seen confidence drain without a word being said, you recognize this part. It doesn't collapse all at once. It fins. The older man adjusted his cuffs slightly and looked toward the approaching vehicles. Then back at Pritchard. "This will move quickly now," he said. And for the first time, Pritchard didn't have a response. The second Suburban didn't stop behind the first. It pulled past it. Slow. Intentional. Like it already knew exactly where to position itself. Doors opened before the engine fully settled. No rush, no confusion, just coordination. Pritchard watched it happen without moving. His posture hadn't changed, but the meaning behind it had. Before, it was control. Now, it was uncertainty trying to look like control. The older man glanced once toward the new arrivals, then back at Pritchard. "Who trained you on federal plate masking protocols?" he asked. The question wasn't casual. It was precise. Pritchard blinked. "That's not standard patrol training." "Exactly. A beat." Then the older man stepped slightly closer. Not aggressive, just narrowing the space. "And yet you overrode a federal advisory without escalation?" That word again. Overrode. Not ignored. Not missed. Overrode. Behind them, one of the new agents opened the rear door of the Ford. Not by force, with a key. That detail landed quietly, but heavily. Because it meant something simple. They had access. Authorized access. The door creaked open, revealing nothing unusual at first glance. Just an old interior, worn seats, dust, a toolbox on the floor. But the second agent leaned in and reached beneath the dash. A small click. Then he pulled something out. Not large, not dramatic. A compact black device, no bigger than a paperback book, wired cleanly into the vehicle's internal system. He held it up slightly. The older man gave a small nod. Confirmation again. The kind that didn't need explanation. Pritchard stared at it. "What is that?" he asked. No one answered immediately, because the answer wasn't for him. It was for the process now unfolding around him. The first agent finally spoke. "Mobile surveillance relay. Simple. Flat." But the implications spread fast. This wasn't just a parked vehicle. It was part of an active grid. Monitoring. Recording. Possibly protecting. And Pritchard had just tried to remove it from operation. The radio on his shoulder cracked again, but this time it wasn't dispatch. "Sergeant Miller en route. 1 minute out." His supervisor. Late. Too late. Pritchard swallowed. That was new too. Small. Almost invisible. But real. The man in the gray cap stepped closer now, standing just behind the agents. No longer an observer. "Part of it. You've got full log integrity?" he asked. The second agent nodded. From initial plate query, bodycam. A pause. Then a glance at Pritchard. Yes. That word hit harder than anything else, because Pritchard hadn't turned it off. He had followed protocol, and now protocol was working against him. The older man looked at him again. Not angry. Not satisfied. Just assessing. "You understand what happens next?" he asked. Pritchard didn't answer, because now he did. And saying it out loud would make it real. Down the block, a marked patrol SUV turned the corner. Lights off, but moving faster than everything else had so far. Sergeant Miller, the chain of command, finally arriving. But the balance had already shifted. When Miller stepped out of his vehicle, he took in the scene in under 3 seconds. Tow truck, federal vehicles, multiple agents. Pritchard. His expression didn't change much, but his pace did. Faster than usual, controlled, but urgent. He approached the older man first. "Sergeant Miller," he said, extending a hand. The older man shook it once. No introductions needed beyond that. "Your officer initiated an unauthorized tow on a protected asset," the older man said. Direct, clean, no embellishment. Miller's eyes flicked to Pritchard. Just once. That look said everything. Not anger. Not yet. Just calculation. How far did it go? Miller asked. Lifted, not transported, the first agent answered. Miller nodded slowly. That mattered. A line hadn't been fully crossed, but it had been approached dangerously. Miller turned to Pritchard. Walk me through it. That was standard procedure, but the tone was different. Lower, tighter. Pritchard opened his mouth and stopped, because for the first time since this started, he didn't have a clean version of events. Everything he could say was already logged, already seen, already understood. I ran the plate, he said finally. It came back incomplete. Miller waited. And? I made the call. Too simple. Too thin. Miller's jaw shifted slightly. Did you receive an advisory? Silence. Short, but final. Yes. There it was. The moment. Not loud. Not dramatic. But irreversible. The older man didn't react. The agents didn't move. But something in the air settled. Like a conclusion had just been reached. Across the street, a small group had gathered. Nothing chaotic, just quiet attention. People sensing something official, something unusual. No one spoke loudly. No one interfered. They just watched. Because scenes like this don't need explanation. They explain themselves. The second agent placed the device back into the truck carefully, reconnecting it with practiced precision. Operation restored. Continuity preserved. As if undoing damage. Miller exhaled slowly and looked back at the older man. What's your next step? He asked. The answer came without hesitation. We notify internal affairs and federal oversight. Full review. Not optional. Not delayed. Immediate. Miller nodded once. He understood. This was no longer his scene to manage. Pritchard stood there, still holding the folded tow authorization. But now, it felt like evidence. Not paperwork. Evidence. The older man adjusted his jacket slightly, then looked at Pritchard one last time. You weren't supposed to notice that vehicle, he said. A pause, let alone move it. That sentence stayed in the air longer than anything else, because it reframed everything. This wasn't just a mistake. It was interference with something intentionally invisible. And now, it wasn't invisible anymore. If you've ever seen the exact moment a situation leaves local control and enters something much bigger, this is it. Quiet, final, unavoidable. Miller stepped slightly aside as one of the agents made a call. Short, direct, confirmed, proceeding. That was it. The door had opened, and what came next wouldn't be contained to this curb. The first official call didn't sound dramatic. No sirens, no raised voices. Just a quiet confirmation moving through the wrong channels. Internal affairs notified. That was enough. Because once that line is crossed, the process doesn't slow down. It accelerates. Pritchard felt it immediately, not physically, systemically. His cruiser terminal refreshed again, this time locking him out of active input. The keyboard stopped responding. The screen shifted into a restricted mode. User access limited. Review pending. He tapped a key anyway. Nothing. That small loss of control hit harder than the badge across from him. Behind him, Leon stepped away from the tow rig entirely, wiping his hands on a rag that didn't need wiping. I'm clear of this, right? He asked no one in particular. No one answered him, because he already was. Contractor. No decision authority, just execution. And he had stopped when it mattered. That difference would follow him, but not destroy him. Across the curb, more quiet movement. Another unmarked sedan. Two more individuals. This time not field agents. No earpieces. No urgency. Clipboards. Tablets. Observers. That was worse, because observers don't fix problems. They document them. Miller stood slightly off to the side now, speaking low into his phone. Yes, I understand. No. He acknowledged the advisory. Yes. A pause. Then quieter. I know. That, I know, carried weight. Not defensive, not protective. Resigned. Pritchard watched him, waiting. For support, for correction, for something that would shrink this back down to a departmental issue. It didn't come. The older man from the Suburban turned slightly as another agent approached him with a tablet. Preliminary timeline, the agent said. He handed it over. The older man scanned it quickly, then tilted the screen just slightly so Miller could see. Not Pritchard. Miller leaned in. Read. And for the first time, his expression changed. Barely, but enough. A tightening around the eyes. Because now, he wasn't just hearing it. He was seeing it laid out. Second by second. Plate query, 812. Federal advisory triggered, 813. Advisory dismissed, 81327. Tow request logged, 814. No supervisory contact. Tow initiated. Clean. Undeniable. Pritchard shifted his weight. That log doesn't show context, he said. No one looked at him. That was new. Before, every word he said forced a response. Now, it didn't, because the conversation had moved past him. The man in the gray cap spoke again, quieter this time. Pull prior complaints. One of the observers nodded, already typing. That was the second collapse. Not the incident itself. The pattern. Because once patterns enter the room, this stops being about a single decision. Pritchard felt it. Hold on, he said. This isn't. The older man raised a hand slightly, not to silence him, to pause the moment. Then he looked directly at Pritchard again. First time in over a minute. You're still thinking this is about the truck. Not a question, a statement. And it landed clean, because it was true. Pritchard had been focused on the wrong center of gravity the entire time. The second agent stepped closer with new information. Sir, we've got 2 prior advisory dismissals tied to this unit. That changed everything. Not loudly, but completely. Miller closed his eyes for half a second. Just one, then opened them again. Decision made. Daniel, Miller said. First name, not rank, not officer. That mattered. Step away from the vehicle. Pritchard didn't move. Not immediately, because stepping back now wasn't just physical. It was symbolic. It meant giving up the last piece of ground he still occupied. I followed procedure, Pritchard said. It came out flatter than he intended. Less confident, more defensive. Miller held his gaze. No, he said quietly. You didn't. Silence. The observers were already moving. One documenting the tow truck ID. One photographing the cruiser unit number. One noting timestamps verbally into a recorder. 826. Officer non-compliant with advisory escalation protocol. Not loud, but impossible to ignore. Pritchard finally took a step back. One, then another. Small, but final. That was the collapse. Not shouting, not arrest, just removal from control, from authority, from the center of the situation. The older man handed the tablet back. Federal review will proceed, he said. Then, after a pause, and we'll be recommending temporary operational suspension of involved personnel. Clinical, measured, but devastating. Pritchard looked at Miller, waiting again, for pushback, for negotiation, for anything. Miller didn't give it, because he couldn't. Across the street, someone whispered, "Secret Service." The word spread quietly through the small crowd. No chaos, just understanding. Leon climbed back into his tow truck, started the engine, but didn't move yet, waiting for clearance, for permission, for the moment to reset. The Ford sat exactly where it had been, untouched now, restored. Like the last 10 minutes were being slowly erased, everywhere except the record. If you've ever watched a system turn on one of its own, you recognize this phase. It doesn't explode. It organizes, documents, locks in. Miller stepped closer to Pritchard one last time. Low voice, private, but still audible enough. They're going to pull everything, he said. not a warning. A fact. Pritchard nodded once, barely, because now he understood. This wasn't stopping here. It was expanding. Behind them, one of the agents closed the rear door of the Suburban. Another made a final call. Short, clear, proceed to formal. That was it. The line had been crossed completely. And what came next wouldn't happen on the street. It didn't happen at the scene. That part was already over. What mattered now happened behind doors that didn't open for explanations. By 9:40 a.m., Officer Daniel Pritchard's access had been fully suspended. Not just patrol duty, everything. His credentials no longer opened internal systems. His unit assignment was flagged. His bodycam footage, already uploaded automatically, had been locked under review. No discussion. No delay, just process. Internal affairs didn't wait for statements. They started with data, time logs, dispatch audio, vehicle system records, and the one detail that quietly anchored everything: the dismissed federal advisory at 8/13/27. That timestamp appeared in every report because it didn't require interpretation. It showed intent. By noon, the story had already widened. 2 prior incidents surfaced. Same pattern. Advisory warnings. No escalation. Independent decisions. Small at the time. Ignored until they weren't. In a conference room 3 floors above the precinct floor, the tone stayed consistent. No accusations. No raised voices. Just reconstruction. Step by step. What did you see? What did you understand? Why didn't you escalate? Each question measured. Each answer thinner than the last. Pritchard didn't collapse all at once. He tried to hold the line. At first, it was confidence. I made a judgment call. Then irritation. The system wasn't clear. Then doubt. I thought it was a clerical issue. And finally, silence. Because every version ran into the same point. He had been warned and chose not to stop. By late afternoon, federal oversight formally entered the review. Not aggressively, not visibly, just present. That changed the outcome before it was even written. The truck never moved again. Not that day, not the next, because it wasn't just a vehicle. It was part of something larger. An operational grid tied to a protective detail that no one at the precinct had clearance to fully understand. And that was the quiet truth underneath everything. Pritchard hadn't just made a bad call. He had interfered with something designed to remain unseen. 3 weeks later, the result came down. No courtroom, no spectacle. Administrative. Final. Termination of duty. Certification review pending. Federal notation attached to record. Not criminal, but permanent. Sergeant Miller signed the last document without commentary. He didn't defend Pritchard, didn't condemn him either, because by that point, the system had already done what it always does when everything is documented clearly enough. It corrected. Leon, the tow driver, went back to work the next morning. Different calls, different streets. He told the story once or twice, carefully, not exaggerated. Just sometimes you don't know what you're touching. The man in the gray cap never appeared in any report. Not by name, just a line in a federal log. Witness present. No interference. And the truck, it stayed where it was supposed to be. Quiet, unremarkable, invisible again. Like it. If you step back far enough, the whole situation feels smaller than it did in the moment. No arrests, no headlines, no dramatic ending, just a series of decisions, recorded in order. And one of them didn't align with the rest. That's how most collapses actually happen. Not through chaos, through documentation, through small choices that don't look important until someone reviews them all at once. And if there's anything worth taking from this, it's not about the badge, not even about the mistake. It's about the moment in between, when the system gives you a chance to pause, and you decide not to. It waits. Because in the end, nothing here was hidden. It was just ignored. And that's all it took.